Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to take a closer look at frequency and equalization. Frequency is one of those tools in recording that is so critical, that is very important for anybody looking to further their career or further their skills in recording, that they truly understand what frequency is all about and how to use the equalizer. So let's get started. So sound is vibrations that travel through the air. Sound also travels through liquids, gases, and solids. These vibrations are caused by any vibrating object, such as vocal cords or guitar strings or speaker cones. Now, the rate at which sounds vibrate is known as frequency. So if you can imagine, you have all these sounds going on around us. So they're all these sounds are arriving at our ears in vibrations. And so you got all these vibrations coming at you, and the frequency is just the rate of that vibration. When you think of frequency, think of pitch in music. So you might think of a low pitch, like a really low key on the piano, okay? Or a very high pitch, like a violin. Okay, so frequency is similar to that. You know, low tones have low frequencies, whereas high tones have higher frequencies. However, frequency is an absolute and precise measurement, okay, while pitch is somewhat of a relative term, typically expressed using letters. So if you get, a few musicians together, they might all agree that the song that they're playing is going to be in C, the key of C. So they might tune accordingly to one another. But as engineers, we go for a much more absolute, precise, numerical metric when we're looking at frequency. So again, let's think about sound as being vibrations, okay? And when we break those vibrations down to their smallest component, we call that a cycle, all right? So think of a cycle as like an S on its side. What you're looking at here is a sound chart, okay? And you're looking at one cycle. So it starts at the center line, all right, goes over the center line, crosses it, and comes right back to it. And so with frequency, we measure these cycles in seconds. So this particular cycle you're looking at would be 1 hertz, or 1 cycle per second. And of course, hertz is the unit of measurement for frequency. If we were to look at another sound, and let's say this next sound has 3 cycles per second. So it starts at the center line, goes over it, crosses it, and comes back. That would be 1 cycle. And then we do the same thing. Crosses over, comes back, crosses over, comes back. So this particular sound would be 3 cycles per second, or 3 hertz. So as you look at these, we actually can't even hear sounds that would be this low on the frequency scale. It would be way lower than what we're able to hear. But this chart gives you kind of a simplified way to view the nature of frequency. So if you look at lower frequencies, which would be the chart on the left, you could say that lower frequencies have larger waves. So you see that's a pretty big cycle. So that's a much larger wave. They have slower waves, because if you compare the chart on the left to the chart on the right, in 1 second, the chart on the right, there are 3 of those cycles in each second. So those would be much faster. Whereas on the left, you just have 1 cycle. And you could also say about lower frequencies that they have longer wavelengths, whereas shorter or higher frequencies have shorter wavelengths. So again, that's a pretty simplified view, but the reason that's important is because when we look at the frequency range of human hearing, we can hear from 20 hertz on the low end all the way up to about 20 kilohertz on the high end. And really, when you look at those lowest frequencies all the way down to 20 hertz, a lot of those lower frequencies are really felt more than they would be heard. Same on the high end. There comes a point probably around 15 or 16 kilohertz where we no longer can really hear those frequencies, but you might be able to feel those frequencies. So let's look at what this means for us as audio engineers, okay? every instrument, every musical instrument that we record, whether it's, guitars, keyboard, basses, voice, they all have, a fundamental frequency that is somewhere along this frequency range. And so let's start with the sub bass. Your sub bass is going to have a frequency fundamental of around 40 hertz. And so what this would mean, for example, is if you are mixing a sub bass and you really want to bring out those low tones in that sub bass, you could boost 40 hertz on your equalizer, and that would in effect give you a little more of that sub bass sound, or those tones that really make the sub bass what it is. Moving right along, your bass guitar has fundamental frequencies that would be somewhere between 60 to 80 hertz. So again, you want to bring out the bottom, bring out the kind of the roundness in that bass sound. You could look at those frequencies between 60 to 80 hertz, and then you'd be able to boost the frequencies that really bring out those lower tones in that bass that you're going for. And we'll talk about in just a moment, if you have a range of frequencies that you're choosing from when EQing a sound, there's a way that you can use that equalizer and sweep and go through those ranges until your ears tell you what the appropriate frequency is. And we'll look at that in a moment. 100 hertz is where you really get the thump in that kick. Your kick drum, if you really want that kick to really attack and thump hard, you could boost 100 hertz to accomplish that. Now, there's a frequency at 300 hertz, which is called the mud frequency. And actually, those mud frequencies can be anywhere from 300 hertz to 500 hertz, and even a little bit higher on some instruments. But mud is a lack of clarity. It's kind of when you're listening to a sound and it just sounds a bit muffled. It just doesn't have that clarity that you would hope for. You could use your equalizer and you could reduce those frequencies around 300 hertz, and that would reduce that muddiness and in effect give you more clarity to the sound. And this is an important frequency, really important, because a lot of times we do go for clarity of our sounds, and sometimes when we're recording in environments or in rooms that maybe aren't as acoustically sound, for lack of a better word, you could decrease that mud to really eliminate frequencies that might be keeping your sound from being as clear as they could be. 1000 hertz or 1 kilohertz, of course, kilo is 1000. So 1 kilohertz would be the snare. That would be, if you're really shooting to get that snap on that snare, to make that snare really crack, you could boost those frequencies around 1 kilohertz, give or take, and you would really bring out, that particular sound in the snare. 2 to 4 kilohertz is the range where you're going to find the vocal enunciation. This is an important range for a lot of engineers, particularly home studio engineers who spend a lot of time recording and mixing vocals. If you really want to make the enunciation of speech clear, if you really want to, give those vocals a really polished sound, in addition to cutting that mud, you could boost some frequencies in that 2 to 4 kilohertz range, and you would accomplish it. 5 kilohertz is the presence frequency. So if you're trying to just bring overall presence to a particular sound or a group of sounds, you could boost the frequencies around 5 kilohertz. 6 to 7 kilohertz is approximately where you're going to find sibilance. Sibilance is that hard S sound. Sometimes when you're recording and you get done recording and you just hear that S that just won't quit, that is definitely a problem when recording vocals. And if you don't have a de-esser, which would help you to really smooth out or eliminate that S, then you could use your equalizer and really try to shave away or cut away those frequencies in that 6 to 7 kilohertz range, and you'd be able to reduce that sibilance. And really what a de-esser does is it really does focus in on that frequency range and allows you to, reduce that hard S and F sound, which is also known as sibilance. 8 to 10 kilohertz is a frequency you could boost to really bring out the sizzle in your hi-hats and cymbals and really give you that brightness. It's also known as the shimmer frequency. Sometimes you can add a touch of that shimmer to a vocal to really bring out that breathiness or airiness in a vocal. So this is your brighter frequency ranges up in that 8 to 10 kilohertz range. And 10 to 15 kilohertz is, again, it could also include some shimmer frequencies. That's where your air is at, and additional brightness. So ultimately, you're going to use your ears, and you're going to be able to learn to use an equalizer to sweep and kind of find those frequencies which are going to have, a positive impact on your sounds. Another thing I have to note, there's a lot of instruments that aren't on this chart because there's only so much room here. However, many instruments are in the mid-range sound or mid-range area. So you have guitars, you have pianos, you have obviously vocals and synthesizers. A lot of instruments fall in what is known as the mid-range, which could extend as low as 167 hertz all the way up to maybe 5 or 6 kilohertz. So one of the challenges of engineering is finding a way to really allow each of these sounds to have their own space within the mix. And so it's really important when you're equalizing that you're able to really bring out the best in all of your sounds, but not use the equalizer in such a way that you're boosting the same frequencies on multiple sounds so that you don't really have good separation between sounds. So keep that in mind. There are a lot of sounds that are going to overlap in terms of the frequencies that that the sounds are based upon, but it's your job to not only know the ranges, to use on an equalizer to make something sound better, but also understand how to sweep, how to actually use the equalizer to sweep around and find that ideal point for each sound. So sounds resonate or vibrate at their fundamental frequency, which is the lowest frequency of a particular sound, and at their harmonic frequencies, which are kind of other natural frequencies. So I'm talking right now. And so if you were to boost my vocals in that 2 to 4 kilohertz range, you'll definitely bring out kind of the enunciation of speech. But there are also frequencies that could be positively impacted by using an equalizer. There's other harmonics that exist in my vocal besides 2 to 4 kilohertz. So for example, if you look at a bass, okay, a bass, let's say, has a fundamental of around 80 hertz. And harmonic frequencies are typically whole number ratios of that fundamental. So if the fundamental is 80 hertz, there would be a harmonic that would be somewhere around 160 hertz. And then if you add 80 to that, there'd be another harmonic around 240 hertz, and then 320 hertz. And you could go on and on. So there are times when, you really want to do less on an equalizer. Obviously, you don't want to go boosting, 4 or 5 or 6 different frequencies. But if you are looking for other frequencies that could add, polish to your sound, then you can know just by what that fundamental frequency is, what other harmonic frequencies might come into play. Individual sounds have unique frequency responses and characteristics, obviously. And humans are most sensitive to mid-range frequencies. So we're looking at 250 hertz up to 5 kilohertz. Some will say, mid-range is all the way down around 167 hertz up to, 5 or 6 kilohertz. But we're going to be most sensitive to those frequency ranges. So when we're mixing music and producing music, you really want to keep that in mind. And you don't want to have a lot of clutter, a lot of sonic clutter in that range. You want to have good separation within the sounds that are in that range. Frequencies beneath 40 hertz are often considered noise or rumble, whereas frequencies above 15 kilohertz, give or take, are normally felt and not heard. So that can be best described as air. So the equalizer is a tool that is used to adjust the volume of frequencies. That's what it's designed for. It allows you to raise or lower various frequencies so that you can, at times correct an issue with a sound, and sometimes allow you to really accentuate, tones within a sound that are going to bring out the best in that instrument. So equalizers are used on individual sounds for shaping by boosting or cutting frequencies that are unique to the individual sounds. Kind of like what we discussed before. Every sound has its own unique frequency and its own unique characteristics. Equalizers can also be used on groups of sounds and the entire mix as a whole to, again, shape the sound, to add more polish, to take away maybe mud or lack of clarity. Cutting or reducing the volume of a frequency or frequencies is oftentimes more useful than boosting a lot of frequencies. Cutting is a little more of a graceful process. Sometimes, again, oftentimes you could have a sound that isn't clear, is muddy. And I know I've mentioned that a few times, but it's very common to get rid of those frequencies that are creating that mud. A lot of times those frequencies in that very low end, under 40 hertz or so, will completely cut away because we're not really hearing those. Sometimes those sounds or frequencies are more or less mud or noise, or I shouldn't say mud, but are more or less noise or rumble. And so we want to cut those frequencies away. A lot of times just cutting can do a great deal for your individual sounds. Typically, a band or range of frequencies is boosted or cut. So it's an entire band. It's not necessarily one frequency, but it's that frequency that you're highlighted as well as those frequencies around it that get boosted or cut. The width of a band is referred to as the Q factor or Q. So, and we'll look at that in a moment. It's much easier when you're able to see it on an equalizer, but just remember the Q is the width of the bands of frequencies that get impacted when you're boosting or cutting. The volume of a frequency itself is raised or lowered in decibels or dBs. So let's take a look. This equalizer here is called the EQ37 Band, and it's one of the equalizers available on Pro Tools. And when you take a look at it, along the bottom of the graph on the right here, you have your frequencies right along the bottom. So from 20 hertz all the way over to 20 kilohertz. So that x-axis from left to right is your lower frequencies going over to your higher frequencies. Along this y-axis on the side, you have your decibels or dBs. So right along this center line is 0, right? At 0, nothing is happening. The frequency is flat, basically. You're not doing anything at all. But then you have the option to either increase a certain frequency. So if you increase it, you see you get positive decibels, or you can decrease. So you can reduce or get negative decibels if you're decreasing a particular frequency. So again, when you're looking at its flat frequency response, it means it's unaltered. So this particular equalizer is color coded. So you have these dots, red, orange, yellow, green, and so on and so forth, which basically correspond to frequency bands down here within these various frequencies that you can then go in and manipulate. So if we were to look at this green band, which says the frequency is 2000 hertz or 2 kilohertz, you will see that it's unaltered. The dot is right at 0, so it's unaffected at all. So remember, that flat line means an unaltered or flat frequency response. So again, looking down at these bands at the bottom, the frequency is in this middle area. You can see FREQ. So most of the time, what we're going to do is we're going to set the frequency that we want to impact, okay, that we want to raise or cut, which we do with the gain, which is on the bottom here. So gain, once we decide what frequency we're going to manipulate, we can either boost it or cut it using this gain knob, or actually going up to the dot and pulling that dot down or pulling that dot up. It's going to allow us to raise or lower that particular frequency. And then the Q is right on top here. And the Q is typically a number. So the lower the number, the wider the Q, the wider the frequency band, the higher the number, okay, the more narrow the Q, or more narrow the frequency band. All right, so again, the Q factor or Q is how wide or narrow is the frequency bandwidth. So when you're boosting, go ahead and use a wide bandwidth. So you could use a low Q, for example, 1. And then on the EQ37 band, by default, the Q is already set to 1. So you could basically keep it there. But when cutting, use a more narrow bandwidth. For example, you could use a 3. So if you use that higher number, that's going to give you a more narrow bandwidth. And then another thing to keep in mind, if we look at this, LF stands for low frequency. The HF stands for high frequency. Then you have high mid frequency, and low mid frequency. So this filter affects the shape of the actual frequency envelope, and we'll look at that in a moment. But you really want to pay attention to the shape or the frequency filter that you're using. And again, we'll look at that in 1 second. But that definitely is going to have an impact on what it is that you actually do. And again, on these couple of bandwidths up here at the top are what's known as your high pass filter, which is right here, and your low pass filter, which is here. And on these, you also have a Q, has a little bit different number. The Q on the high pass and low pass are basically measured in decibels. So typically, the higher this number here, the sharper or steeper the curve on that Q. And the lower the number, the less steep the curve is. And then you also have a frequency there as well. So let's look at these frequency filters, or types of frequencies. When you see this particular shape here, it's known as a high pass filter. And a high pass filter rolls off or cuts frequencies that are below a given frequency. So you're going to determine what frequency you want to basically select, and everything under that frequency gets rolled off or cut. Everything above that frequency passes unaltered. So it's called high pass filter. Everything higher than the frequency you set passes unaffected. Everything lower gets rolled off. Then you have your peaking filter, which is your typical bell curve. So when you see that symbol there, this is your typical, it looks kind of like a mountain, or a valley, your typical bell curve. And this allows you to boost or cut a specific band of frequencies. Very common filter type there, the peaking filter. Your low shelf filter, it affects all frequencies that are under a given frequency. So let's say, for example, you set your frequency at 100 hertz. If you have a low shelf on and you decide you're going to boost those frequencies, everything under 100 hertz gets boosted. If you lower your low shelf, everything under 100 hertz gets cut. So your low shelf, whenever you hear these shelving frequencies, especially on a low shelf, everything beneath that frequency gets impacted by whatever you're doing, boosting or cutting. The notch filter, which is the shape here, it cuts an entire band of a given frequency range. So using a notch filter is like surgery. When you want to completely remove a certain frequency from a sound, you could use a notch filter and it would completely get rid of a certain frequency. And you, again, set the Q of that notch. And typically with a notch filter, you have a very narrow Q because you want to be very specific about the frequency that you want to get rid of. And again, it's more like surgery, sonic surgery. Then you have your high shelf filter. Your high shelf, similar to the low shelf, it's going to affect all frequencies, but in this case, it affects frequencies above a given frequency. So if you set your frequency at 10 kilohertz and you have a high shelf on, if you decide you're going to boost that, everything at 10 kilohertz and above gets boosted. If you want to cut it, everything at 10 kilohertz and above gets cut. So it has more of a global impact. When you use these shelving filters, they have more of a global impact on the sounds beneath a certain frequency, which is in the case of a low shelf, or above a certain frequency in the case of a high shelf. And again, with shelving, the impact happens on the frequency you select, as well as those frequencies under it in the case of low shelf, or above it in the case of high shelf. And then you have the low pass filter, which is the opposite of the high pass filter. This is going to roll off or cut frequencies that are above a given frequency. So let's say, again, let's use 10 kilohertz. If you set 10 kilohertz as your frequency to use on your low pass, everything above 10 kilohertz gets rolled off. Everything under it or lower pass through unaffected. So low pass. Let all those frequencies lower then what you set pass through unaffected. Everything above them gets rolled off. So these frequency filters are important because you'll use different equalizers. Sometimes, you're not even really paying attention, and you just start boosting or cutting. You just want to be careful as to exactly what you're doing. You could have a high or low shelf on and not even know it. So just keep that in mind. So there are some rules, and I'll put that in quote, to equalization. And the reason I say rules is because, it is good to kind of understand the fundamentals and understand the basics. But honestly, engineers do things differently. Everybody has their own style and their own method. And a lot of times in engineering, there's more than one way to do a number of things. But these general rules are going to kind of, get you off to the right start, or make sure that you can kind of develop a consistent process that's going to allow you to have, a more professional sound. Okay. So number one, you want to listen first. Listen to what it is that you're going to equalize, and make sure the EQ is necessary. And also just listen and try to hear for yourself what might need to be done to make a particular sound come across a little better between two speakers. Okay, what's going to really add to that sound, or what do you need to kind of remove from that sound just to make it sound better or make it sound more natural? So you also want to consider cutting or decreasing before you boost. Cutting can have a really positive impact on sounds that you equalize, because a lot of times what you're cutting is mud, or places where you don't have a lot of clarity, or maybe you're cutting irritation. Maybe on electric guitars you have some frequencies in that 2 to 4 kilohertz range that are just irritating, and you can kind of cut those sounds. So consider cutting before you boost. Another thing, and again, we're going to look at this in a second, you want to sweep certain frequency ranges to determine appropriate bands that you do want to boost or cut. Sweeping is just really one of those techniques that is going to just be a part of your arsenal of tools. You can have a general idea of what the appropriate frequencies would be to boost the kick, or to boost the snare or vocals, but every kick is different. Every snare or vocal is a little bit different. So you don't necessarily want to get in a habit of just using specific frequencies for specific instruments all the time. You want to sweep. You want to use your ears and kind of sweep around until you find, the best adjustments for the sound that you're mixing at that time. Again, use a narrower Q when cutting. That's going to be a higher number. Use a wider Q or a lower number when boosting. And be sure to use the correct EQ filter type. We just talked about that. And, make sure, if you're trying to just boost or cut and you just want to use that typical peaking filter, make sure it's on that and not a shelving filter. So for whatever you're trying to accomplish, use the correct EQ filter type. A little goes a long way when you're equalizing, and be careful not to overdo it. It's real easy to boost sounds a little bit too much. They start to sound unnatural, and sometimes you can even add, irritation to a sound, or add a lot of sibilance to a sound because you're adding too much. Even on the bottom end, you can add too much to those low frequencies and really add muddiness or lack of clarity. So be careful with that. And also, you can be a bit more liberal when you're boosting higher frequencies than lower frequencies. Remember, those lower frequencies have really big waves. They take up a lot of space between two speakers. And so if you're going to add or boost some of those lower frequencies, you don't want to go too overboard with it. Now, with the mid-range and higher frequencies, those are smaller waves, right? And so sometimes you can afford to boost a little bit more on that higher end than you would on the lower end. But at the end of the day, use your ears. Use your ears and just don't go too far. And also, just when you've done all that, you've done your equalizing, you think you got the sound you want, listen again and do before and after comparisons. And just make sure that you have corrected the issue that you intended to correct. Or that you've complemented the instrument sound that was your initial goal. All right. The last point I want to make before we actually take a look at doing some equalization with the Pro Tools Equalizer is that there are different types of equalizers, okay? And a couple of the more common types are parametric and graphic equalizers. Now, with a lot of our digital software, right, and these plugins that we're using, many of those equalizers are parametric EQs, similar to the EQ37 band. The equalizer on the bottom there is a graphic equalizer. Now, the parametric equalizer is variable, meaning the frequency, the Q, and the gain can be set according to your specific needs. And it's the most flexible of equalizers and real common in our digital equalizers. Your graphic equalizer is an equalizer where the frequency bands for cutting and boosting and bandwidth are typically fixed. So you don't necessarily set what the frequency is going to be or what the bandwidth is going to be. Those are set by the manufacturer. And then you can determine if you're going to boost or cut. So if you look at this graphic EQ on the bottom, the frequencies are already set along the top. And you have a fader here that you can basically boost or cut. Car stereos are a good example of fixed band equalizers. So you might have a bass and a treble. You can't dial in exactly what frequency you want to boost with the bass. It's already preset. Same thing with the treble. So that's basically, the differences between these two very common types of EQs. The parametric is more, variable, and the graphic equalizer is basically set by the manufacturer. Let's take a look at how we're actually going to apply equalization to a mix. So in front of us, we basically have a mix that's broken down into kick and snare, and then you have some overheads, which are cymbals. We have some guitars and bass. So we have several instruments that we're going to be equalizing. So what I'll do is just take a little time here to just show you one approach to using an equalization that's definitely going to improve your sound in general. So let's just take a minute and listen to what it is we're going to be working on. All right, so basically this is a jazz project, and regardless of what the genre is, if you have a mix in front of you that is completely separate, where you have separate tracks, then you're going to have to go through and equalize the individual tracks, and you want to equalize these tracks based on their own frequencies, their own unique frequency characteristics. So let's start and look at the kick. So you'll notice on this particular track, and this is Pro Tools here that we're looking at, under our insert column, we already have a compressor set up. There are different ways to approach the equalizer. Some engineers feel that you should equalize before you compress. Others feel you should compress before you equalize. Getting started here, we are compressing first, but we're going to look at projects down the road where we will actually use the equalizer first. So it's this insert column in Pro Tools that we're going to use to actually insert our effects. And based on the order that you have your plugins, that is the order that your sounds get processed. So if the compressor is first on the list, it's going to compress first and then go to that second plugin, which in this case will be equalizer. So we're going to hit plugin, EQ, and we're going to go to the EQ37 band, and here it is. All right, and so I'm going to solo this track, which is the kick, and I'm just going to play it, and I'll turn it up a little bit so it can be heard. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use our high pass filter. And right now on the EQ37 band, the high pass filter symbol is already selected for this band here, HPF, high pass filter. And I'm going to turn it on. All right. And when I turned it on, if you look at this graph here, something has already started happening. All right. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the frequency to about 40 hertz, because if you remember in our earlier discussion, those frequencies under 40 hertz a lot of times are considered noise or just low end rumble. So we're just going to get those completely out of the way by cutting those frequencies under 40 hertz. So if you look at this chart now, you can see this dot, this gray dot represents 40 hertz. And so what is happening is the frequencies under that 40 hertz are slowly getting taken out. Now we want to increase this Q. So on your high pass filter, the Q is in decibels. So we're going to type 18, use 18 decibels. And you see now we have a much steeper curve. So now this high pass filter is more aggressively getting rid of or rolling off the frequencies under that 40 hertz. And again, the nature of the high pass filter is whatever your frequency is, everything higher passes, it's unaffected. Everything lower gets rolled off. So you're going to start with this high pass filtering every time you equalize. Okay, and that again is going to start us out by getting rid of any low end rumble or any type of low end noise that might actually be or exist on the track. The next thing we're going to do is cut the mud. Now again, this is a parametric EQ, so it's variable, meaning we could choose any one of these bands to go ahead and set as our mud frequency band. But we're going to settle in on this low mid frequency. I mean, it's the closest to 300 hertz, so just kind of makes sense to use this one. And your mud is really technically in your low mid frequency range. So we set our frequency to 300 hertz. We're going to cut our mud. So when we cut mud, we can cut it anywhere from 4 to 6 decibels. Okay. In the case of like your lower frequency instruments, like your bass and your kick, I'm not going to really cut that too much because I don't want to take the body away from that kick. You know, the kick still needs bottom in its sound. So I'll cut that by about 4.5 decibels. All right. So I'll bypass my setting for a second to hear my before and after. That's before. And that's after. Very subtle difference, but I can tell and I know that I've gotten rid of some of that mud and I've used a low pass filter to get rid of any low end rumble. So we're going to do this every time we approach an equalizer. We're going to cut first and we're going to cut in this order: high pass filtering and then reduce the mud. Next, I'm going to focus on the frequency that's going to really bring out the thump in my kick. But before I do that, let me go ahead on the low mid frequency and raise that Q. I'm going to raise that Q up to about 2 right now, because remember, we're going to have a more narrow Q if we're cutting. So if you look at this frequency range here, if I increase that Q, you see how narrow that gets? So the higher that Q, the fewer frequencies that get impacted around the frequency that I set. If I lower that Q, so I lower that number, the bandwidth gets wider, so more frequencies get impacted around the frequency that I have actually told, you know, the equalizer to focus on. So in the case of cutting, again, we're going to use a more narrow Q. So we'll just put it up to about 2. You know, 2 or 3 is fine. So we'll just go to 3 for now. So we've cut our mud. We've used our high pass filter. Now we're going to focus on the fundamental of the kick. And remember, from the frequency chart we just looked at, 100 hertz is going to give us, you know, really that thump of that kick. Okay, so I'm going to change the filter here over to our peaking filter, and this low frequency is already on 100 hertz. So I'm going to do a little sweeping. So I'm going to raise that frequency all the way up. I'm raising it up so I can really hear the impact of boosting that frequency. Then I'm going to sweep a little bit. I'm going to go a little bit higher than 100 hertz. And then I'm going to come back and go a little bit lower than 100 hertz. So as I get lower, the tone is a little rounder to me. As I get higher, it has a, you know, it's not as round of a tone. So I kind of prefer a little bit of a rounder tone. So in this case, I'm going to go right about there for my frequency, and then I'm going to bring the gain back down. And really on that low end, you really only need to boost maybe 2 to 3 decibels, and it's going to, you know, it's going to have the impact that you're looking for. So now I'll bypass. So before and after. So as I look at my kick, this is basically what I would need to do on this equalizer. and then I could move on to my next instrument. Now, there's a lot of different theories when it comes to using the equalizer. There are different ways to approach the equalizer. The approach that we're going to use, again, is to do our cuts and then find that one frequency that's going to really enhance the sound, okay? The sound that we're actually equalizing. So let's take a look at the snare. I'll solo this snare. And this was a live band recording, so you do hear other instrument sounds in the background. You're just getting microphone bleed. And on a lot, especially on your drum instruments, you will get some bleed because you have multiple mics on the drum set. In fact, I think what I'm going to do is go down and actually look at the guitar. Let's look at this guitar here. And I'm going to add an equalizer, right? The EQ37 Band. Again, I'm going to start out at the high pass filter and turn it on and set my frequency to about 40 hertz because we're going to roll off everything under 40. Raise my Q to 18. That's step number 1. Step number 2, let's cut the mud. So I'm going to go to my low mid frequency band. I'm going to reduce my mud. That sounds pretty good to me. So anywhere from 4 to 6 decibels will be good. The less mud you cut, the more bottom or body you're going to leave into that sound. The more mud you cut, the thinner that sound's going to get. So I'm going to cut that about 5 decibels, and then I'm going to increase my Q. You know, and again, that Q, anywhere from 2 to 3 on a Q is going to be fine. You just want a more narrow bandwidth when you're cutting as you do when you're boosting. All right. So let me bypass that and hear before and after so far. So I can hear that slight difference, a little more clearer sound when I use that high pass filter and cut the mud. Now for the guitar, you know, I'm going to look at a frequency range between 1 and 3K, but I'm going to sweep just to be sure. So I'll go to this mid frequency band, which is already at 1K, and I'm going to take that all the way to the top. And again, when we're sweeping, we go extreme just so we can really hear the impact of that frequency boost. And then I'm going to sweep a little. So the more I go towards 3K, I get that type of guitar sound. As I come back closer to 1K, it's got a little bit more of a fullness to the sound. So I'm going to go right there. Once I found that, I'm going to go ahead and bring that gain back. And when I'm boosting my middle range frequencies up to my high frequencies, I can have a little more of a gain boost than I would look for on my lower frequencies. So I'm gonna actually boost that by about 4 decibels. And then again, I'm gonna do my before and after. That's before. That's after. So again, a little more of a polished sound, and that's really what we're going for here. So you're going to use this method on all of your sounds. You know, the high pass filtering and the mud is going to be consistent on every instrument that you use the EQ on. What will change is that fundamental frequency that you're looking to boost, and that's what that initial chart was for. So if you're dealing with a vocal, you should know that 2 to 4K is what you're going to be boosting. If you're dealing with a bass guitar, 60 to 80 hertz is what you're going to be boosting. If you're dealing with cymbals and overheads, 8 to 10K is what you're going to boost. And you want to sweep to really find what's going to sound the best. So that's a little bit more information on using the equalization and what frequency is all about. The best thing to do at this point is the practice. The more that you use the equalizer, the more mixes that you actually are involved in, the more this type of information and these techniques are going to become second nature to you. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and definitely have a lot of fun mixing.